My name is Elena. I'm 31 years old, and the first thing I heard when I woke up from a 3-week coma was my stepmother's voice saying one word, so softly I almost missed it. Finally, I did not open my eyes. I do not know exactly why. Some instinct that arrived before my conscious mind had finished orienting to the room, the light, the sounds of hospital equipment, the specific quality of air that belongs only to places where people are being kept alive by machines, rather than by their own momentum. I lay still. My stepmother moved closer to the bed, and then she said something else, something meant for the person beside her, spoken in the voice people use when they believe no one who matters is listening. I have been in that room 1,000 times since in my memory. I am still not sure which part of what I heard was worse, what she said, or the fact that my father did not tell her to stop. That was the moment I understood that the accident had not been the most dangerous thing that happened to me that month. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Some betrayals announce themselves loudly. The ones that nearly destroy you arrive quietly, while you are lying still, and everyone around you believes you cannot hear them. Subscribe before we go any further and tell me your first name and your city in the comments. Now let me take you back to before the hospital room. I need to tell you who I am and what I had before I tell you what they tried to take. My name before I was Elena Ross was Elena Calloway. My mother was Margaret Calloway, who died of an aggressive ovarian cancer when I was 14, and who spent the last 8 months of her life doing something I did not understand until I was old enough to understand it, which was making sure that what she had built would reach me rather than the people who would come after her. My mother was a commercial real estate developer, not large scale. She did not build towers or manage portfolios that required institutional backing. She found undervalued properties in mid-size markets, bought them at the right moment, renovated them with the care of someone who understood that a building's character was an asset as real as its square footage, and leased them to tenants she selected with the same care. She did this for 18 years, and she was very good at it. She was also precise. She kept records the way architects keep drawings, with the understanding that accuracy was not bureaucracy, but protection, and that the protection was for the people who came after, rather than for herself. When she died, she left me 3 commercial properties in a trust structured so that it could not be accessed until I turned 25. She left me shares in the small property development company she had founded. She left a separate account that would fund my education and living expenses until the trust activated. And she left a letter that her attorney gave me on my 25th birthday, delivered in a sealed envelope with my name on the outside in her handwriting. The letter said, among other things, that she had thought carefully about the structure of what she was leaving and that she had made it as protected as she knew how to make it. She said she was not naive about what money did to people who had not earned it and who believed they had a claim on it. She said the protections she had built were not because she did not trust me. They were because she did trust me, and she wanted to make sure the trust was honored by the systems around me, even when the people around me were not trustworthy. I read the letter on my 25th birthday, sitting in my apartment with my coffee going cold. I thought about it again in the hospital room, lying still with my eyes closed, listening to my stepmother's voice. My mother had known something I had taken 11 years to learn. My father's name is Richard Ross, 58 now. He remarried 4 years after my mother died when I was 18 and leaving for college, which meant the timing felt like something that had been managed rather than coincidental. He had been seeing my stepmother, Catherine, for at least a year before he told me about her, which I know because I found a photograph of the two of them dated 8 months before her first dinner at our house, filed in a folder in his office that I had been looking through for a different reason entirely. I did not say anything about the photograph. I was 17 and I had already learned which observations in my household were welcome and which ones closed rooms. Catherine presented herself as warmth itself when I met her. She was 44 then, attractive in the polished way of someone who had been maintaining a version of herself for an audience since her 20s, and she had the social fluency of a person who understood immediately what a room needed from her and provided it without appearing to try. She was kind to me at every dinner I attended that year. She asked about my studies. She remembered details from previous conversations. She expressed an interest in my mother's real estate background with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She asked on 3 separate occasions in my final year of high school questions about the trust structure my mother had left. I answered generally because I did not yet have the framework to understand why the questions were arriving in the sequence they were arriving in. My godmother Patricia did. Patricia Holt had been my mother's closest friend since their 20s and had been named my godmother when I was born and had attended every significant event of my life with the steady presence of someone who takes the role seriously rather than decoratively. She was 62 now, a retired estate attorney who had drafted some of the protective language in my mother's trust documents. She met Catherine at my high school graduation dinner. She called me the next morning. She said, "Be careful of her questions." I said, "She seems genuinely interested." Patricia said, "She is genuinely interested. That is exactly what I'm telling you to be careful of." I did not understand then. I would understand 4 years later when I woke up in a hospital room. I moved to Atlanta after college. I had a degree in business administration, and I went to work for a commercial property management company, not because I needed the income, but because I wanted to understand the industry my mother had built her life in before I took responsibility for what she had left me. I worked there for 3 years. I learned things I could not have learned from documents or inheritance alone, which was how buildings worked as businesses, how tenant relationships were maintained, how the gap between a property's condition and its potential was identified and closed. I turned 25 the March before the accident. Patricia gave me my mother's letter. I activated the trust. I had a meeting with the trust's independent financial manager, a woman named Grace, who had been managing the account since my mother's death, and who greeted me with the warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time to finally meet the person they have been working for. The trust at activation contained the 3 commercial properties, the company shares, and an investment account that 10 years of conservative management had grown to an amount that took me a moment to absorb when Grace showed me the statement. My mother had been careful. She had been very careful. Catherine's behavior shifted the week after my 25th birthday. I noticed it then but did not name it correctly. The questions became less general. They became transactional. She asked about specific properties. She asked about the company's board structure. She asked whether I had considered updating the trust's management arrangements now that I was the controlling beneficiary. I gave general answers. I told my father she had been asking questions. He said, "She is just interested in your success. She cares about you." I noted the deflection. I did not push. That was in March. The accident was in September. I had been driving back from a property inspection on a Thursday evening, a secondary highway, the kind with the particular quality of late afternoon light that makes it difficult to judge distances accurately. A truck running a red at a junction I was crossing with right-of-way. I do not remember the impact. I remember the light before it, and then nothing until the hospital room 3 weeks later. The doctors told me afterward that I had been in a medically induced coma for 11 days and a natural coma for another 10. They told me my brain activity had been monitored and had shown signs of returning awareness in the days before I actually woke. They told me my recovery was remarkable given the severity of the initial injury. They told me all of this after. While I was in the coma, people had spoken to me freely. Visitors came. Nurses came. My father came. Catherine came. They spoke in the lowered voices of people in medical spaces, and they said things that the unconscious body lying in the bed was not supposed to be processing. The body was processing everything. I came back slowly, first sound, then light through my eyelids, then the capacity to locate myself in space, then thought, arriving in fragments that assembled gradually into coherent understanding over a period of hours on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the accident. I knew where I was before I opened my eyes. I knew by the sounds and the smell and the texture of the sheets and the specific quality of the silence between the machines. I lay still and I oriented. Then the door opened. Footsteps. 2 sets. One I recognized as Catherine's by the sound of her shoes, a pattern I had been hearing for 13 years. One I recognized as my father's by the weight and pace of it. The door closed behind them. Catherine moved to the side of the bed. She looked at the monitors for a moment. Then she said one word, so softly that if I had been any less alert, I would have missed it. Finally, I lay still. I controlled my breathing with the focused attention of someone who understands that the next several seconds matter more than any that have come before them. Catherine turned slightly toward my father. She said something else, something that told me, in under 10 words, what had been happening in the 3 weeks I had been lying in this bed. I did not move. I did not open my eyes. I lay in the hospital room in the late morning light, and I thought about my mother's letter and what she had written about the systems she had built to protect what she was leaving me. I thought about Patricia's voice on the phone the morning after my graduation dinner. Be careful of her questions. I had been careful of her questions. I had not been careful enough of her answers. That was about to change. The thing Catherine said after finally was 7 words. I have counted them many times since. One more signature, and it's all ours. She said it to my father in the lowered voice of someone who has been saying things in hospital rooms for 3 weeks and has become comfortable with the assumption that the person in the bed is not receiving the information. My father said nothing in response. That silence was its own sentence. I lay completely still, and I catalogued what I had just heard with the focused attention of someone who understands that the next several minutes are a document being written and that every detail of it will matter later. One more signature. Not we hope she recovers. Not the doctors think she is improving. One more signature. The language of a transaction in progress. The language of someone who had been working through a sequence and had arrived at the final step and was expressing relief at the proximity of completion rather than at the consciousness of the person they were standing over. All ours. Not hers, not the family's, ours. 2 people, a closed circle. My father had not told her to stop. The door opened again. A nurse entered, said something about vitals, moved around the room with the efficient quiet of someone doing a routine task. Catherine and my father stepped back. The nurse checked the monitors, made a note, left. The door closed. Catherine said, "When is Hargrove coming?" My father said, "Tomorrow morning, 9. Catherine said, "Tell him to bring the full transfer documentation. I want everything ready." My father said, "I will." I noted the name Hargrove. I noted tomorrow morning. I noted full transfer documentation. Then I noted something else. My father's voice had the quality of a man following instructions, rather than participating in a conversation between equals. Not reluctant, not coerced, just a man who had ceded the direction of something to someone else and had stopped thinking of the direction as his to question. That told me more about the 3 weeks I had been unconscious than anything Catherine had said. They left together at 11:40. I lay still for 20 minutes after the door closed. Then I opened my eyes. The ceiling of a hospital room is a particular shade of white that exists nowhere else, institutional and neutral and designed to give the person looking at it nothing that could produce emotion in either direction. I looked at it for a long time. I took inventory. My body was present in the ways that mattered. I could move my hands. I could turn my head slowly. The right side of my body had the heaviness of disuse rather than damage. My left arm had a line running into it. My head ached with the steady persistence of something that had been aching for a long time and had simply become the ambient condition. I was alive. I was, for the first time in 3 weeks, also strategically positioned. Hargrove was coming at 9 the following morning with full transfer documentation. I had approximately 22 hours. I needed 2 things: an ally in this building who understood what was happening, and a way to reach Patricia before 9 o'clock tomorrow. I lay still and I thought. The nurse who had come in for vitals had a name tag I had not been able to read from the angle I was lying at, but she had touched my wrist when she checked my pulse, and her fingers had paused for a fraction longer than a routine check required. Not long enough to be certain, long enough to be notable. She had noticed something. I was going to need that noticing to be useful. Her name was Adez. She came back for the evening vitals at 4:30. She checked the monitors first. Then she came to the bed and she checked my pulse with the same 2 fingers at my wrist, and this time I pressed back. One small increase in pressure, barely perceptible. The kind of signal that only registers if you are already paying the right kind of attention. She went still. She did not look at the door. She did not change her expression. She simply maintained her clinical composure with the practiced ease of someone who has been trained not to react to surprising information in rooms where reactions have consequences. She said, in the same quiet, professional voice she would use for anyone, "I am going to check your temperature." She placed the thermometer, and while she waited, she leaned slightly closer to the monitor she was pretending to read, and she said, barely above a breath, "Blink once if you can hear me." I blinked once. She straightened, made a note on her chart, took the thermometer reading, made another note. Then she said, in the same clinical tone, "I am going to adjust your position slightly for comfort." She moved to the side of the bed. While she adjusted the pillow, she said quietly and directly, "You have been showing signs of awareness for 2 days. I documented it in my personal notes, not in the main chart. I did not know who to trust." I pressed her wrist once with my fingers. She said, "There is a woman who has visited 3 times who is not on the approved family list. She signed in as a family friend the first time. She has a man with her who I believe is an attorney. They came while your stepmother was here yesterday, and your stepmother asked them to leave." I pressed her wrist again. She said, "Do you want me to contact someone?" I pressed once for yes. She said, "Tell me how." I could not speak yet. My throat had the rawness of 3 weeks of intubation and disuse, but my hand could move enough. Adez understood before I had to ask. She brought a notepad from the supply cart, put a pen in my right hand, held the pad at an angle I could reach. I wrote 2 things, Patricia Holt, and her phone number, which I had memorized at 14 and had never once failed to remember. Then I wrote one more word, tonight. Adez looked at what I had written. She looked at me. She said, "I will call her from my personal phone on my break, not from the hospital system." I pressed her wrist. She said, "Do not open your eyes for anyone else tonight, not until I tell you it is safe." I closed my eyes. She finished her chart notes and left. I lay in the bed and I cataloged everything I had heard over 3 weeks from a position everyone believed was passive. I need to tell you what I knew by that Thursday evening. I knew it because I had been unconscious for 3 weeks in a room where people spoke freely, and because the brain, even in its most compromised state, records. Not everything, not cleanly, in fragments that had been assembling themselves since the moment awareness began returning, the way a document reassembles from fragments when you have the right software and enough time. Catherine had visited 11 times. I knew this because different nurses mentioned it in different conversations, and I had been counting. My father had visited 7 times. Patricia had visited 3 times and had been asked to leave twice. A man whose name I had heard as Hargrove had visited once, with Catherine, on a day when my father was not present. That visit had lasted 40 minutes. The conversation I had partially heard was about documentation and authorizations and the timeline for finalizing a transfer of management authority. A different man, whose name I had not caught, had visited on 2 separate occasions and had spoken to my father in a tone that was different from the attorney tone, lower, more careful, the tone of someone delivering news that required careful handling. I had heard the phrase power of attorney in that conversation. I had heard the phrase medical proxy. I had heard, on the second of those visits, my father say, "How much longer do we need to wait?" The other man had said, "The doctors are saying 2 more weeks before they make any permanent determinations." My father had said, "And if we move before then?" The man had said, "Then we need the documentation to be airtight." That conversation had happened on a Tuesday. I did not know which Tuesday. I did not know how many days before I woke up. But I knew what it meant. They had not been waiting for me to recover. They had been waiting for a timeline that served a legal process I had not been consulted about. My father was not a man who had been manipulated by a woman he loved into participating in something he did not understand. My father was a man who had been participating in something he understood entirely. That was the part I kept returning to in the hours between Adia's visit and Patricia's arrival. Not Catherine. Catherine had announced herself, over 13 years, in ways I had chosen not to read correctly. She had asked about the trust. She had asked about the properties. She had asked about the management structure. She had done it pleasantly and consistently, and I had attributed it to the curiosity of a woman who was interested in her stepdaughter's life. It had not been curiosity. But Catherine was a woman I had never trusted completely. The discovery of her intentions was painful without being shocking. My father was different. My father had stood in a hospital room and asked how much longer we need to wait while his daughter lay unconscious in the bed 3 feet from him. That was the betrayal that had no framework I could fit it into without rebuilding the framework from the ground up. Patricia arrived at 8:15 that evening. I know, because Adiaze came in at 8:10 and said quietly while checking my IV line, "She is in the parking structure. I am going to bring her through the staff entrance. There is a window of approximately 12 minutes before the charge nurse does her rounds." I pressed her wrist. Patricia came through the door at 8:18. I heard her footsteps, and I knew them the way I had known Catherine's footsteps. The rhythm of someone I had been listening to my entire life. She came to the bed. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Elena, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." I squeezed her hand. She made a sound that was not a word, the sound of someone absorbing a relief they had been containing for 3 weeks. She sat in the chair beside the bed and she leaned close and she said, "I am going to tell you what I know, and I need you to listen without reacting, because Adaiz says we have 11 minutes. I kept my eyes closed. I pressed her hand once for yes. She said, "Catherine filed for temporary medical power of attorney on day 4 of your hospitalization. The filing cited your father's distress and his request that she manage the medical decisions. The hospital's legal team flagged it as irregular, but your father confirmed the request in writing, and it was granted on a limited basis." I pressed her hand. She said, "On day 9, a man named Hargrove, who is an estate attorney Catherine retained 18 months ago, submitted paperwork to the trust's financial manager requesting an emergency review of the management structure. He cited your incapacitation and what he described as your father's rights as the original co-trustee. She said, "Grace, your trust's financial manager rejected the request and contacted me immediately. I have been in contact with Grace since day 10. I pressed her hand twice. She understood. She said, "Grace has not processed anything. She has been stalling through procedural requirements, requesting documentation that takes time to produce, asking for clarifications that require responses. She has bought us time." She paused. She said, "Hargrove is coming tomorrow at 9 with what Catherine described to your father as the final transfer documentation. I do not know exactly what the documentation contains, but I believe it is intended to complete a transfer of management authority over the trust's primary assets while you remain incapacitated." She said, "Elena, they believe they have 3 days before the medical team makes any permanent determinations about your condition. They are trying to complete the transfer before your medical status changes." She said, "What I need to know is what you want to do." I opened my eyes. Patricia looked at me. She did not react with the visible surprise of someone encountering the unexpected. She had spent 40 years as an estate attorney. She had been waiting for this moment since the night Adiaze called her from a personal phone in a hospital parking garage. She said, "Hello, sweetheart." I said, in a voice that came out as barely more than a whisper from 3 weeks of disuse, "Hargrove cannot walk into this building tomorrow." She said, "He will not." I said, "I need Grace to have documentation of my awareness before 9 o'clock. She said, "Adiaze has been keeping personal notes since Tuesday, dated, time-stamped, clinically formatted. She will sign them tonight." I said, "And the medical team?" Patricia said, "I have an attorney colleague who specializes in medical legal matters. He is available tonight. He can be here by 6 tomorrow morning." I said, "Does he know the situation?" She said, "He knows enough." I said, I need to know everything that has been moved, everything that has been filed, everything that has changed hands since the accident. Patricia reached into the bag she had brought and placed a folder on the bed beside me. She said, I have been preparing this since day 10. I opened the folder with hands that were slower than I was used to and less steady but functional. The folder contained 14 pages. I read every one. By the time I finished, my voice was steadier than it had been when Patricia arrived, and the ache in my head had the quality of something that had been given a direction to move in rather than simply persisting without purpose. I looked at Patricia. I said, They made 2 mistakes. She said, Tell me. I said, They used Hargrove, and Hargrove used the same trust documentation my mother built, the documentation she built with you. Patricia looked at me. I said, You know every protection in those documents, every clause, every condition. She said, I drafted most of them. I said, Then you know the authorization chain they would have needed to bypass. She said, Yes. I said, Did they bypass it correctly? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, No, they did not. I said, Show me. She showed me. By 10 o'clock that evening, Adayas had signed her personal notes in the presence of Patricia and the medical legal attorney who had arrived at 9:30. By 11, the trust's financial manager, Grace, had a formal notification of my recovered awareness with supporting documentation from 2 medical witnesses. By 11:30, Patricia had filed an emergency motion with the probate court requesting an immediate freeze on any trust-related transactions pending a capacity review. By midnight, Hargrove's appointment the following morning had been rendered procedurally irrelevant. I lay in the hospital bed, and I thought about my mother sitting at her desk 18 years ago, building protections she hoped I would never need. She had built them anyway, because she had understood something that Catherine and my father had not understood when they began their careful 3-week process. The protections were not in the trust documents. The protections were in the people who had helped build them. And those people had been waiting for me to wake up. The medical legal attorney's name was David Chen. He was 53, precise in the way of someone who had spent 30 years at the intersection of healthcare and law, and had developed, through that work, a complete absence of sentimentality about situations that required clarity rather than comfort. Patricia had worked with him on 3 cases over the previous decade and had described him on the phone the previous night as someone who does not waste words or time. He arrived at 6 in the morning as promised. He reviewed Adayez's documentation first. He reviewed his own notes from the previous evening's assessment. He spoke with the attending physician, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who had been managing my care since the accident and who had, as it turned out, her own concerns about certain decisions made during my incapacitation that she had been unable to raise through official channels without documentation to support them. Dr. Okafor had been watching. She had not been certain of what she was watching, but she had been watching. David met with her for 40 minutes in a conference room down the hall while I lay in my bed, and Patricia sat in the chair beside me, and we did not speak because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said, and because both of us understood that the next several hours were a process rather than a conversation, and that the process required patience more than it required words. At 7:15, David returned. He said, Dr. Okafor is prepared to file an amended capacity assessment documenting your awareness as of Thursday evening. The assessment will be time-stamped and will supersede the existing medical status documentation that Hargrove's filing relied on. I said, What does that mean for the power of attorney? He said, Catherine's temporary medical power of attorney was granted on the basis of your incapacitation. The moment a current capacity assessment establishes your awareness and communicative ability, the basis for the power of attorney is no longer valid. It does not require a court order to invalidate. It invalidates automatically under the terms of the original grant. I said, and Hargrove's appointment. He said, Patricia's emergency motion was received by the probate court at 11:47 last night. The court's duty judge reviewed it at 4 this morning and issued a temporary freeze on all trust-related transactions pending an emergency capacity hearing. The hearing is scheduled for Monday. He said, "When Hargrove arrives at 9, he will find that there is nothing left for him to do." Hargrove arrived at 9:04. I know because a Dieze was at the nurse's station when he came through the main entrance, and she sent me a single word on the notepad she had left with me. "Here." I folded the notepad and placed it under my pillow, and I lay still with my eyes open, and I waited. He came to the room with Catherine. They opened the door together. Catherine stopped. She looked at me. She looked at my open eyes, and the pillow adjusted behind me, and the glass of water on the bedside table that I had asked for and drunk from, and the notepad edge visible at the edge of the pillow. She looked at Patricia sitting in the chair beside the bed with a folder on her lap. She looked at David Chen standing near the window. Then she looked at me again. I said, "Good morning, Catherine." My voice was still not what it had been 3 weeks earlier. It had the quality of something being used for the first time after a long period of stillness. But it was present, and it was clear, and it arrived in the room with the weight of something that had been absent for 3 weeks and had now returned. Hargrove understood before Catherine did. He was an attorney, and attorneys read rooms for a living, and he read this room in approximately 4 seconds, and understood that the document folder under his arm was not going to be opened today. Catherine said, "You're awake." I said, "I have been awake since Thursday afternoon." She said nothing. I said, "I heard you on Thursday morning before I opened my eyes. You and my father." Her expression moved through several stages. The first was disbelief. The second was the calculation of someone assessing whether disbelief was a viable position. The third was something that did not resolve into any expression I had a name for. I said, "Patricia has filed an emergency motion with the probate court. The trust transactions are frozen pending Monday's hearing. The power of attorney is invalid as of Dr. Okafor's amended capacity assessment filed this morning." Hargrove said, "I would like to speak with my client." David Chen said, "Of course, the hallway is available." Hargrove and Catherine left the room. The door closed. Patricia said nothing. I looked at the ceiling for a moment, then I said, "Where is my father?" Patricia said, "He called the hospital at 7:30 this morning. Dr. Okafor's office told him that your status had been updated. He has not called again since." I said, "He knows." She said, "Yes." I said, "Is he coming?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Neither do I." He did not come that day. He came the following morning alone, without Catherine, and without Hargrove, and without the specific performance of concern he had maintained throughout the 3 weeks of my hospitalization, when he had been visiting 7 times while planning the completion of a financial transfer. He came at 8 in the morning when the hospital was doing its morning rounds, and the corridor outside my room had the ambient noise of an institution beginning its day. He stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had spent the previous 36 hours arriving at an understanding of himself that he had been avoiding for a long time. He was 58 years old, and he had built a version of himself around a woman who had been asking questions about his daughter's trust since before he had told that daughter the woman existed. He had let those questions become a direction. He had let the direction become a plan. He had stood in this room 3 weeks ago and asked how much longer we need to wait while I lay in the bed. He knew that I knew that. He came into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed that Patricia had been occupying, and he looked at his hands. He said, "I don't know how to start." I said, "Then don't start, just tell me the truth." He said, "I knew what Catherine was planning. I knew from the beginning, not every detail, but the direction of it." I said, "How long?" He said, "She began talking about the trust structure the year after we married. I told myself she was just curious. I told myself it was because she cared about what happened to you." He stopped. "I knew that was not true by the time you turned 25. I let myself keep not knowing because the alternative required me to do something I was not willing to do. I said, 'Leave her.' He said, 'Yes.' I said, 'You chose her.' He said, 'Yes.' He said it without the defense of a man who has prepared a case for his choices, just the admission, the accurate description of a decision he had made. I looked at my father, 58 years old, the man who had held my hand at my mother's funeral and told me we would figure everything out together, and had meant it, I believe, At the moment he said it, I said, "The hearing is Monday. I need you to tell the court what you know, the full extent of what was planned, the documentation you signed, the conversations with Hargrove, everything." He said, "That will be used against Catherine." I said, "Yes." He said, "And against me." I said, "Probably, yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would not forgive me for this." I said, "I know." He said, "Can you?" I sat with that question honestly rather than reflexively. I said, "I don't know yet. That is the most honest answer I have." He nodded. He said, "I will be at the hearing." He stood up. He looked at me once more from the doorway with the expression of a man who has laid something down that he had been carrying in the wrong direction for a long time and is not yet sure what walking without it feels like. Then he left. The Monday hearing lasted 3 hours. I was present in person, which had required a medical clearance from Dr. Okafor and a wheelchair for the first portion before I demonstrated that I could stand and did. My father testified first. He told the court the full extent of his knowledge, the conversations with Hargrove, the documentation he had signed, the timeline of Catherine's planning as he understood it. He answered every question Patricia's attorney colleague put to him without deflecting and without the managed version of events. It cost him considerably. It was also, I believe, the most honest he had been in a professional context in several years. Catherine's attorney attempted to characterize the trust's financial manager, Grace, as having acted improperly in refusing to process the transfer requests. Grace brought 14 months of documented correspondence to the hearing that demonstrated she had followed every procedural requirement correctly and had raised concerns through appropriate channels at each stage. The court reviewed Hargrove's transfer documentation. Patricia had been right about the authorization chain. My mother had built a trust with a layered authorization structure that required independent verification at each stage of any major transaction. The verification at Stage 3 required a signature from the trust's independent legal counsel, a role held by an attorney my mother had named specifically in the trust documents when she created them. That attorney was Patricia. Catherine and Hargrove had not known Patricia's role in the structure, or they had known and had believed she could be bypassed. Either way, the bypass had not been completed, and the Stage 3 authorization was missing from every document in Hargrove's folder. The transfer had never been legally executable. My mother had known something 18 years ago that had protected her daughter in a hospital room 3 decades later. She had known that the people most likely to try to take something were the people closest to the person who held it. And she had built the protection accordingly, anchoring it in a relationship she trusted, rather than in a structure that could be navigated by someone with enough time and the right attorney. She had trusted Patricia. Patricia had held. The court froze all pending transactions, invalidated Catherine's power of attorney with retroactive effect, and referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. My father was removed as co-trustee. I was confirmed as the sole controlling authority. The consequences that followed arrived with the procedural thoroughness of systems that move deliberately rather than quickly. Catherine was arrested 4 months after the hearing. The district attorney's investigation uncovered the full extent of the planning, including evidence that Hargrove had prepared forged authorization documents for the Stage 3 verification that had not been deployed because the window had closed before they could be used. The forgery charge was the one that mattered most structurally. It transformed the case from a civil dispute about trust management into a criminal matter with specific evidence of intent. Hargrove surrendered his law license pending the outcome of the bar investigation that followed. Catherine's assets were frozen during the investigation. The luxury items she had purchased in the weeks following my accident, anticipating the transfer's completion, were subject to recovery proceedings. My father cooperated fully with the investigation. His cooperation was taken into account but did not eliminate consequence. He was removed permanently from any role in the trust structure. He faced civil liability for his participation in the planning and reached a settlement that required him to pay back into the trust the amount he had been paid from its accounts during a period when he had been acting against my interests. He was living alone by the time the settlement was reached. Catherine had moved out when the arrest became imminent. She had made the calculation that proximity to him no longer served her and had acted on it with the same efficiency she had applied to everything else. I left the hospital 12 days after the Monday hearing. Dr. Okafor released me with the specific satisfaction of a physician whose patient has recovered in defiance of an early prognosis and who takes that defiance personally as a professional achievement. Adayeze walked me to the exit. At the door, she said, "You were the calmest person I have ever seen in a situation like that." I said, "I had a very good teacher." She looked at me. I said, "My mother. She taught me that the protection is in the people who helped you build it, not in the documents." Adayeze said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." I said, "She was precise," which turned out to be the same thing. 8 months after the accident, I was sitting in the office of the Trust's financial manager, Grace, for our first quarterly review since I had taken full control. The Trust was intact. The properties were performing. The company's shares had increased in value during the period when Catherine's management interference had been blocked by Grace's procedural stalling. The investment account continued to grow with the conservative patience my mother had established. My mother's careful work had survived. Patricia came to dinner at my apartment that Saturday. I had cooked the way my mother had taught me, with attention rather than speed. And we sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that were not the case and not the hospital and not the hearing. We talked about my mother. Patricia said she would have found the whole thing infuriating. I said she would have found it predictable. Patricia said that too. She said she knew what she was protecting against when she built those documents. She had seen it in other families. She wanted to make sure you had something that would hold, even if the people around you did not. I said, "The authorization chain." Patricia said, "She called me the week before she died. She said she wanted to go through the documents one more time. We spent 3 hours on the phone. She made 2 small changes." Patricia looked at her wine glass. One of them was the stage 3 requirement. I said, "She added it in that call." Patricia said, "Yes." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "She knew." Patricia said, "She knew something. She did not know exactly what, but she knew enough to add one more layer." I thought about my mother in the last weeks of her life, managing her company from a chair while her body made its way toward an end. She was precise enough to be honest about, calling her attorney to add a stage 3 authorization requirement to a trust document for a daughter who was 14 years old and did not yet know why it would matter. She had done it anyway, because that was who she was. I woke from a 3-week coma and kept my eyes closed. I heard my stepmother and my father planning the completion of a financial transfer that had been in progress since the day of my accident. I lay still for hours and cataloged everything. A nurse named Adayeze noticed my awareness and contacted Patricia. Patricia arrived that evening with 14 pages of documentation she had been preparing since day 10. We filed an emergency motion at 11:47 that night. The probate court froze all transactions by 4 in the morning. Hargrove arrived at 9 and found nothing left to do. My father testified at Monday's hearing. Catherine was arrested 4 months later. The trust was confirmed under my sole control. My mother's stage 3 authorization requirement, added in the last week of her life, was the protection that could not be bypassed. That is the whole story. Now here's what I want to leave you with. My mother died when I was 14. She spent the last weeks of her life making phone calls to attorneys and adding clauses to documents and building structures she hoped I would never need, but that she was not willing to leave incomplete. She could not be in that hospital room with me. But what she built was. That is what real protection looks like. Not a locked door, not a confrontation, not a dramatic intervention. A stage 3 authorization requirement added in a 3-hour phone call from a dying woman who understood that the people most likely to try to take something from you would be the people closest to you when you were most vulnerable. She was precise. Precision, it turns out, is one of the most durable forms of love. The second thing, Adayeze did not know me. She had no obligation to notice what she noticed or to act on it through unofficial channels at personal professional risk. She noticed because she paid attention. She acted because her instinct told her that what she was seeing mattered. Pay attention to the people around you who notice things and act on what they notice. They are rarer than the obvious allies and more valuable when it counts. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever had someone in your corner who did not have to be. For more stories like this one, come find us on the channel. Every story here is about someone who was counted out and turned out to be the one person nobody had properly accounted for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.